welcome back to the Probably Cancelled podcast in association with the Midwestern Marx Institute. My name is Bridget and I'm your host, and today I am here with Inemesit Richardson of the Thomas Sankara Center in Burkina Faso's capital of Ouagadougou. And the Thomas Sankara Center is a library and community education center that is doing amazing work both locally and internationally. And I'm so happy to have Inemesit here today to talk about the story of the Land of the Upright Men of Burkina Faso and the emergence of Captain Ibrahim Traore, who is continuing the legacy of the revolutionary great Thomas Sankara, who's one of my favorite people of all time. So I'm super happy to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm really good. I'm very happy to be on. I'm excited to talk to anybody interested in the revolution happening in the Sahel and the Pan-African struggle being waged worldwide in defense of the Alliance of Sahel states right now.
Yeah, it's super amazing. I wanted to invite you on because not many Westerners know anything about Africa at all, and know nothing about the history of anti-imperialist struggle within Africa. But with the emergence of Captain Ibrahim Traore and him being in the news and doing so many amazing things for his people, a lot more Westerners are starting to find out what has been happening for decades in the region. So having a little educational seminar is always ideal so that people can have one place to go to learn a lot more about the history. So just to start out, how did the transformation from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso under Thomas Sankara occur? Can you speak a little bit about the legacy of Thomas Sankara for those who are not familiar?
Okay, so Thomas Sankara came to power in 1983. Sometimes he's confused as being sort of the father of independence of the country, now known as Burkina Faso, which isn't technically correct, but it is true in a certain way, in the sense that the country that existed prior to Thomas Sankara coming to power, Upper Volta, I would argue is a fundamentally different country from Burkina Faso, which preceded it. So in a way, even though he wasn't the leader that took independence or seized independence from the French, he was the leader who gave birth to the country that is now known as Burkina Faso. Thomas Sankara was a revolutionary Pan-Africanist scientific socialist leader who transformed the country in a 4-year period of time. He only had 4 years before he was assassinated by his right-hand man, Blaise Compaoré, but I think it's very important that we underscore that the CIA played a role in his assassination, as did France, and that there are still documents that need to be declassified to better understand how those Western countries worked to destabilize the Burkina Faso revolution of the 1980s. But to give an overview of what happened during that 4-year period, it's hard to summarize because there are just so many changes. I mean, there were mass campaigns across the country. The basic fundamental unit of the revolution in Burkina Faso was called the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, the CDRs, inspired by Cuba's Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, same name. And it functioned somewhat similarly. They served as eyes and ears of the revolution, but they also carried out popular campaigns to transform society, to transform people's material conditions. So there were campaigns around public health. There was a vaccination campaign where the spanned weeks, children were vaccinated from various diseases, yellow fever, measles, meningitis. There was a massive literacy campaign. There was massive infrastructure building. There was a famous project to build a railway line between Ouagadougou and this a town/city or small city called Kaya. There was a massive emphasis on food sovereignty. One of the things that Thomas Sankara was most famous for was proclaiming that we need to produce what we consume and consume what we produce. So this major emphasis on sovereignty, but especially when it came to the food system. Another quote by him is, where is imperialism? Look at your plate.
This is this really speaks to the misunderstanding that Americans have about communism. Because Americans think communism is about redistributing the wealth and, you know, basically, you know, confiscating property from people and taking over small businesses and stuff like that. And it's not about any of that. What communism is really about is just popular sovereignty. That is what it is about. That and almost nothing else. So you're talking about infrastructure, about, you know, increasing domestic production of what is consumed domestically in order to increase independence. In short, most of the things that the American people really wanted Donald Trump to do, and a lot of things that Donald Trump promised to do and didn't do, you know. And you look at China, of course. China is the quintessential example of that, where it's probably easier to start a small business in China than it is in the US or any other Western country. But the large-scale economic projects are managed by the state and are done in such a way as to buttress Chinese popular sovereignty. And so it's almost the opposite of what Americans think of when they think of communism. Because Americans think of redistributionism, which, by the way, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx talked about how the bourgeois societies use redistributionism in order to buttress their own power because it quells the revolutionary sort of impulse to some degree. And then globalism. They associate communism with globalism. It's the opposite of that. And the thing about it is, Trotsky was a globalist. And so, yes, so Trotsky came, and most of the communist movements in the West that we know of were influenced by Trotsky, because Trotsky left the USSR, came to the West, and became an influential figure in the West. But he was the enemy of the state in the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union was not a globalist project, and because the Soviet Union was a project for popular sovereignty, and because they were sort of proto-Maoists in the sense that they went down to the people and tried to you know, understand what was going on materially so they could actually govern properly. And Trotsky was against all of that. But yes, so they associate communism with globalism, redistributionism, and it's very nearly the very opposite of that.
So really focused on, you know, who controls, you know, what we're eating from on a day-to-day basis. You know, there was an emphasis really on local production across the board. That includes, for example, producing locally made fabrics. There's a fabric called the Faso Ramfani, which is made out of cotton. Burkina Faso is one of Africa's leading cotton producers. And during Thomas Sankara's era, there was a major emphasis on cotton for local production and local use. Unfortunately, after the Sankara era, we see Burkina Faso as a country that's one of the major cotton exporters, but also importing cotton from countries like France. So that's kind of like, we can see sort of the contrast in how, you know, to what was Sankara was pushing and what, you know, happens under neocolonialism typically. There was a massive call for, you know, and also cultural decolonization of the African continent. That was something happening in contingent to a global Pan-African struggle that connected to the diaspora as well. Thomas Sankara famously visited Harlem and stated that our White House is in fact Harlem, and invited the Africans of the diaspora to come to Burkina Faso for the annual Pan-African Film Festival, which was a cultural sort of, it's a cultural event that happens every 2 years, but it was something of a renaissance when Sankara was in power. He promoted the use of local languages, and just to get context around that and what this means in the context of the Sahel. So I think sometimes people see sort of cultural struggles as being delinked from, material struggles, whereas, they really go hand in hand. And so in the Sahel, for example, what we have up until very recently, maybe we'll get into it, is a context where the official language is French, but the vast majority of the population doesn't speak French, cannot communicate in French, and unfortunately it's meant that a lot of the population has not had access to schooling or education, or a pathway to literacy. So historically, during the Thomas Sankara era, there was a major effort to, within the literacy campaign, teach people to read and write in their local languages, like More, Jola, Fulfulde. These are the local African languages that are spoken here. That's a huge contrast to what's typical, which is, and this is something that the current states are working on, but to some extent even to this day, just changing kind of right now. If somebody wants to learn to read and write, they have to learn to speak a second language that they don't know, and then learn how to, read and write from that point. So this would be like maybe for a U.S. audience, like being told that in order to go to school, you need to learn how to speak Japanese first, and then you can learn how to enter a classroom. That's basically what things have been. So there's a major emphasis on a cultural decolonization, but also linked to certain basic sort of material needs in order for a country to be able to develop. I could go on. There's so much that happened in that 4-year period. So much is connected to the Cuban Revolution. I mean, that could be an entire episode in and of itself. But that's a very strong sort of international and Pan-African link between those two revolutions. But yeah, it's...
Well, see, here's the thing. A word that a lot of Western leftoids misuse and abuse is this term decolonization, where what they really mean is, oh, well, we need to be, it's sort of fake and it's LARPish, right? Because, yeah, you're talking about, I don't know, for example, Black Americans, all of a sudden wanting to LARP as like these, Africans from Mali when they've never been to Mali or wherever, and as opposed to here in Burkina Faso, where you can't even get an education in your own language. You have to learn a new language just to get an education. Yeah, that's a real material issue. So it's just ironically, these people want to accuse everyone else of being privileged when they're blind to their own privilege of saying, look, you speak the language of the place you were born in. You get a free education in that language. You're already part of a culture. And, you're upset because the majority of the members of that culture have a different skin color. Incredible privilege. Incredible sense of entitlement. As opposed to Burkina Faso, where people can't even get an education in their own language. They have to learn a new language just to learn to read and write. So yeah, I mean, it's not the same thing at all. That's real decolonization that's taking place there, as opposed to, I don't know, some guy wanting to LARP as whatever, just because they don't like that the majority of the people in their own culture don't look like that. It's like, well, okay, get over it. Anyway.
It's something that has defined Burkina Faso to this day. And just as a final note, I'll say, Burkina Faso, so Upper Volta was a term that the French imposed onto the region that they colonized. So that's the former name of the country. And the origin of Upper Volta comes from Portuguese, because the Portuguese were the first colonizers in West Africa. So Volta is a Portuguese word in origin. It hasn't had no meaning for the people who live in Burkina Faso, and most people don't even know what the Volta River is, because they have local words for the sort of the terms that the Portuguese and the French used. Burkina Faso, on the other hand, is a declaration of revolutionary principles. It means the land of upright people. And so I think there's something really unique in the sense that every single time somebody refers to themselves as a Burkinabe, which means basically a person of integrity, they're actually directly referencing a set of revolutionary principles.
And I know you mentioned before the influences that Cuba has had on.
I really like that. The American in me really, that really appeals to sort of like the American in me, where it's like, the very name you use for people who are part of your culture kind of indicates this sort of revolutionary consciousness and this sort of moral standard of behavior. That really appeals to because ideally that's how I'd like Americans to feel about their culture as well. And I feel like a lot of them do. Like that's definitely a thing in American culture where, to be an American means to embrace something of the revolutionary spirit and traditional values of the American people. So I really like that.
But I was wondering if there are other key influences for Sankara and his revolutionary agenda, and how did they challenge both colonial legacies and global capitalist systems within Africa? I'm sure there are more influences than just Cuba, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Thomas Sankara came from sort of a legacy and a tradition of Pan-African and Global South resistance. So, he had the strongest and most direct influence probably was Cuba, which is why Burkina Faso and Cuba share a slogan, La patrie le monde nous vaincrons, the homeland of death we will succeed. It comes from a direct quote from Fidel Castro. But he was also inspired by other revolutionaries across the Americas, across Africa, and across the world in general. So he had very strong relationships with the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. He went to visit Nicaragua and met with President Daniel Ortega in the 80s. And denounced, the Contras and was very vocal about that. He had a relationship with Maurice Bishop in Grenada, and he spoke about how he met with Maurice Bishop and how he was writing a letter to deliver to Maurice Bishop right before Bishop was assassinated. So he never actually received Sankara's letter, but that was another inspiration that Sankara cited. And then, the African continent, Sankara famously stated that he was inspired by certain Pan-African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba. He had a very close relationship with Samora Machel in Mozambique. And so, he spent time there, he visited there. Outside of that, he had close ties with North Korea as well. There is speculation, and I'm not necessarily certain that I have a official source to confirm it, other than what I've been told by people. But there's speculation that a North Korean, revolutionary artist composed Burkina Faso's national anthem. So the lyrics were written by Thomas Sankara, but I've been told that it was actually a North Korean who composed the song. And so there's a certain history also between those two countries that's there. Sankara visited the Soviet Union, so he was an internationalist. He had this sort of outlook of global revolution, but also very much grounded in a Pan-African tradition as well, an anti-imperialist tradition, revolutionary socialist tradition. So there's a lot of influences that shaped Burkina Faso's, what he called the pop.
And see, that's the huge difference. I don't know if most people catch this, but that's the huge difference between Soviet internationalism and globalism. Because where do you start with Soviet internationalism? You start with socialism in one country, that is socialism in your country. You start from the ground up. You find out what the problems are in your country, and you find out, what the sign of your country is, and you shape the state around that. Then once you've done that, then you have international relationships with all these other countries all around the world who are doing the same thing. And then you establish, logical and constructive relationships with these other countries. I'm driving out in the middle of nowhere, so I lost it. But that's sort of, so like, in order to even have like a basis networks of cooperation between countries across the globe, you almost have to be this sort of Stalinist because otherwise it just flattens everything. That's where you get these sorts of absurd standards that puts your people at a disadvantage. There's a kind of decentralization to it. There's almost a kind of libertarianism to it. But if you let libertarianism run wild without this sort of socialism in one country, what you get is you get a flattening of the world by the corporations, by the multinational corporations. And that's not really significantly different from imperialism. In fact, it is modern imperialism.
Democratic Revolution. So that's the 1983 to 1987 period.
Okay, and then he was brutally assassinated in 1987. What happened to Burkina Faso after the death of Thomas Sankara?
The death of Thomas Sankara was a huge tragedy and setback for the progress of the country. A man named Blaise Compaoré, who played perhaps the most direct and immediate role in Sankara's assassination. I sometimes argue that people focus a little bit too much on him, in the sense that we can never neglect that there was an international conspiracy involved in taking Sankara out. So I always want to emphasize that. But in terms of like who was the most sort of direct figure involved in an assassination on the ground, it would be Blaise Compaoré. And he controlled the country for, like I said, 27 years, reversing a lot of the gains of the revolution at the time. There was a network of pretty much corruption and bribery that was developed that became known as the Compaoré network, that in many ways really, really hurt and crushed the Burkina Faso's left at the time. So a lot of revolutionary organizations were pushed underground, and then others were kind of just corrupted or bought off in some ways by the Compaoré government. It's like all of the progress pretty much was halted. So, we don't really hear about food sovereignty as a goal during this time. This is the era, like I said, where Burkina Faso is selling cotton overseas, but also like you go to the pharmacies and you buy cotton, from France, just an economy that just doesn't make sense. It has nothing to do with the needs of the people. Just a total like French imperialist neo-colonial domination. Also a very, very reactionary foreign policy tied to violent, Western-backed imperialist sort of warmongering in places like Liberia. There's ties to Charles Taylor, who's a Liberian warlord that was an ally of Blaise Compaoré. Jonas Savimbi, a reactionary leader from Angola who has ties to the Compaoré administration. So just total reverse from Sankara's revolutionary government, even on a world scale, this sort of international relations. It was a terrible period of time. It's an interesting period of time from a Burkinabe perspective. There's a certain contradiction in terms of both repression. It was very hard to talk about Sankara. There was a danger in uttering Sankara's name publicly on the one hand, but on the other hand, there was a lot of resistance nevertheless. I think, for me, the most outstanding resistance that
And see, this is the sort of thing that totally invalidates the libertarian argument about this. Or even, let's not say, not even the libertarian argument, but the sort of conservative argument against communism. Because objectively, the people of Burkina Faso were freer under Sankara. And they were less entangled in these sorts of violent conflicts abroad. And perhaps they even had better free speech. And so freedom is almost like happiness in the sense that because the forces that are trying to trample your freedom are collective, the only way to stand up for your freedom is through a form of collectivism. So without socialism in one country, you as a people are not free, which means that you as an individual are not really free. And so there's a Hegelian sort of contradiction here that has to be sorted out. And the way it's sorted out in the context of the Bretton Woods and post-world order is through socialism in one country. That is how you achieve freedom as a people, which then over the long term is what enables you to keep your freedoms as an individual. Because your freedoms as an individual actually cannot be separated from your freedom as a member of a people. It can't be. Because let's say like I'm in the United States and I'm incredibly wealthy, all right? And I'm so wealthy that I can basically buy my freedom. I can do whatever I want. I can send my kids to private school. You know, I can live out in the middle of nowhere. You know, I can, build my own, solar panels and plumbing system and whatever, and have a huge ranch and not have to depend on anybody. Let's just say, okay, but what about the society that my daughter's going to grow up into? What about that? If the people of my society are not free, then I am not free. Even if prima facie my individual freedoms are maximalized, really, objectively, I'm not free because the people that I'm among are not free. You need the people around you. Like you can't live as a hermit. You have to live as a hermit just to be free. Is that even freedom? It's not. How is that freedom of association when you can't have anyone to associate with? So freedom is collective first and individual second. And that's why we need socialism in one country. Even from the perspective of freedom, we need that.
That I think ought to be better known is the way teachers and students organized annually a strike. This is something that was, primary schools, secondary schools. That would be the equivalent of like elementary, middle, high school. Students would take time every year to go on strike alongside their teachers, and the big cry was justice for Thomas Sankara. And I should also mention there were a number of very high-profile political assassinations that happened during the Blaise Compaoré era. One of the most notable was the death of the journalist Norbert Zongo, who was working to expose a lot of Blaise Compaoré's corruption. He's become kind of also considered like a martyr and also a revolutionary figure in Burkina Faso, because he really put his life on the line to expose just the corruption of the era, and he was killed for his reporting. And so he was just one case of a few of just notable sort of political assassinations during that time period. So both kind of a crushing of the left in a way, but also other forms of resistance on a mass level happening, not just in schools, but I think that's just one of the best examples of where people were still pushing back.
Wow. Yeah, oh my gosh. The history is really amazing, and in the past few years we've seen the emergence of Captain Ibrahim Traore. And in what ways has Traore's leadership been compared or contrasted Sankara, or can you just tell us a little bit about Traore and how is he being received by the Burkinabe people?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to go into here. I mean, to touch, it's hard to know where to begin, but to touch on your first point, there's a lot of similarities between how President Ibrahim Traore came to power and how Thomas Sankara came to power. There's a lot of interesting parallels. They both came to power. They were soldiers. You know, these are both people who came through the military and came to power through coups, which has been controversial, I guess, particularly outside of Burkina Faso, for people who don't really understand some of the country's historical context and then some of the relationship between the military and civil society, which is, I think, very unique in the context of Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso has had very many coups. I can't remember off the top of my head how many, but more coups than like electoral transfers to power. And so some of the most revolutionary and reactionary figures have come to power in Burkina Faso through coups. So people are very familiar with what some people have labeled military rule. You know, I think it's kind of, it has a negative connotation. So, but I just want to make the point that people are familiar with, you know, both the absolute best and the absolute worst that it has to offer. And so I think people in Burkina Faso have really the capacity to judge and analyze like what direction sometimes these coups are headed in pretty early on because of that specific sort of historical context. Sankara and Traore are very similar. They were both very young when they came to power. President Ibrahim Traore is the world's youngest head of state, world's youngest president. He's 36 right now. When he came to power, I guess he was 34. I hope I'm not getting it wrong, but it's been like 2 years now. So, or this was 2022, so it's, I still think he was like 34 when he came to power, and he's 36 now, if I'm not messing up here. And then Sankara, when he came to power, if I'm correct, I think he was 36. So they both are coming to power kind of in their mid-30s-ish, which is very, very young compared to, you know, first of all, on an international level, most heads of states are much older in general. I mean, if you look at the United States right now, the United States has had leaders for the most part in their 70s, but also if you look in Africa, the leaders tend to be way older. They both come from the military. They both kind of have, it's an interesting thing, there's like kind of a coup precedes them and then like a counter coup that brings them to power. So Thomas Sankara was involved in a coup before he came to power, and then he quickly realized that it wasn't headed in a revolutionary direction and that he had to do things for himself, and then he took power, which is what happened with Traore. There was a coup that preceded him. It was very quickly the way the process happened. And Thomas Sankara always argued that it wasn't just a coup, it was a popular and democratic revolution, because the people came to the streets, they mobilized, and they really fought for him to come to power because he was a political prisoner under Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo, who preceded him. And similarly,
this just goes to show that what's really taking place is that because this is kind of like on the outer rim of the world, if you think of it like from an imperial standpoint or an economic standpoint, it's kind of on the rim. And on the rim, the fact of the class war that's taking place all over the world, which is really a kind of civil war, a kind of global civil war, it becomes much more obvious and much more clear. That's why voting in replacements out there is not the norm. Is because there's a civil war that's taking place all over the globe, and it's a class war. And out here on the edge of what you might call civilization, it just becomes much more obvious because there's less of an ability to control it by the globalists. And so because there's less ability to control it, there's more capacity for this sort of successful kinetic conflict that you would not see here in the United States, which is also why I'm more skeptical about that happening in the U.S., because there's much more of a globalist control over it. So here, we're more likely to just sort of stagnate and decline until finally the state just sort of implodes. I think that's much more likely to happen here. But out there, yes, kinetic conflict as part of the global class civil war is possible and does happen.
It really is the result of popular mobilizations, if not organizing happening in the leading up to his coming to power. So there's like this mass involvement in terms of pouring out into the streets, these organized campaigns and mobilizations, basically calling for sort of the revolutionary direction that these leaders are going to take. And I'll also say Traoré came to power very much inspired by what was going on in Mali. So it has to be understood that there was a context outside of Burkina Faso that preceded this. So in 2021, there was a coup in Mali that led to President Assimi Goïta taking power. There's a very interesting sort of, context here. For many years, and I personally perceive this more around 2018, 2019, like when this starts to really accelerate, but there begins to be like a popular movement built upon mass frustration with French neocolonialism. And at first, a lot of it was targeting something called the CFA franc, which is a currency system, a monetary system that 14 African countries are subjected to, where they basically use a currency that is printed in France, but it requires them to hold 50% of their national reserves in the French treasury in Paris, and gives France voting and veto power in the regional banks of Central and West Africa. And basically France determines how much the currency is worth relative to the euro, which it's anchored upon. There's a whole history, but basically just to say that like no economic decisions can really be made long term in West and Central African countries that use this currency without France's approval. There's an interesting book about this called, the English title I think is Africa's Last Colonial Currency, A History of the CFA franc by Ndongo Sambasila and Fanny Pijot. So if you're interested in that history, look it up. But in 2018, there started to be like mass protests across the region against this currency. In Mali, that became coupled with a protest against French military occupation. So the French had the majority of their military forces concentrated in Mali for this sort of operation. It's called Operation Barkhane, which was all across the Sahel, but really like Mali was like the main base, the headquarters of basically this like French military occupation. Assimi Goïta put an end to this, and in 2022, Mali gave a very powerful speech at the United Nations stating that while France was claiming to fight against terrorism, to be part of this war against terrorism in Africa, Mali's government basically said that France was arming terrorist organizations and providing them with intelligence, providing these terrorist organizations with intelligence, information, basically helping the side that they claim to be combating. And this was like a whoa moment for Burkina Faso next door, because these three countries share a lot historically. So much context here, but basically, before we were colonized, these are like the same people. A lot of people in Burkina Faso have family in Mali. They speak the same language. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. They speak the same language, on both sides. There's kind of there's a strong sort of feeling of them being sort of like one people that were divided through French colonial sort of balkanization. So there's a strong sort of already shared identity across the region. And to hear like Mali taking this bold move, it really started a lot of like conversation in Burkina Faso. There was like a period of kind of obsession with what's happening next door in Mali, and Mali started to collaborate with Russia militarily, really kind of as a way to de-link from France and sort of de-link from the NATO.
And see, that's the other thing. Objectively, like a lot of sort of like red libs here in the U.S. try to accuse Russia of being fascist. But they're not. They're not. Internationally speaking, they are part of the communist bloc. Even if they themselves are not nominally or literally communist, they are definitely aligned with the global communist bloc. They just are objectively. They are practicing this sort of Soviet internationalism as opposed to globalism, where what she just described with the franc, France doesn't even use the franc. France is exporting the franc tethered to the euro as it's kind of like its own little private petrodollar, basically. That's fascism. That's globalism. Russia is helping these countries escape globalism. So yes, objectively, Russia is an internationally revolutionary force aligned with the communists. They are not an imperialist or fascist power. That's just false.
As a whole, and to find an alternative partner. And so there's this huge push for what the people are calling multipolarity, and that becomes really like the word of the day in Mali and then Burkina Faso. And so the coup happens in Burkina. And then, I'm saying a lot. But
and again, the very idea of multipolarity conceptually is a Soviet concept. It is the only alternative to globalism right now. And it requires socialism in one country and Soviet internationalism. That's what multipolarity is. It's just that for the modern age. That's all it is.
Very short, China comes to power, and I'm sure we can talk a lot about some of the transformations that happened then. About, a little over a year after China comes to power, Niger also has a coup. And this is also something that was very, very long anticipated. So once Burkina Faso and Mali both had coups that turned against the West and both ended French military occupation in both countries, expelled their previous French ambassadors, and began to talk about unifying this sort of Pan-African way. After this happens, all eyes basically were on Niger. So there were a lot of false flags, alerts for a Niger coup actually happened. So I would see, for example, scrolling on social media, Niger coup, but it was made up. It was speculation until it actually happened. So a lot of people were just kind of holding their breath, looking to see, would Niger join? And then, July 26, 2023, Niger has a coup, and things are very quick. In Niger, they expelled the French military immediately. They actually closed the French embassy. It was in a period of a few weeks, it was the country was totally rejecting the neo-colonial trajectory that it had been on up until that point in time. Niger also became the very first African country in history to end cooperation with U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM. So there's actually only one country in Africa that totally refused to collaborate with AFRICOM. That's Eritrea. Eritrea has never signed an agreement with AFRICOM. Egypt technically doesn't, because Egypt is under another U.S. command, but they still collaborate militarily with the United States. They call it CENTCOM. But anyways, just to say, Niger became the very, very first African country to have previously had a military accord with AFRICOM, and to have completely outlawed it, said collaboration with the United States militarily is illegal. And so the three countries collaborate very quickly.
I'll say this, North Africa has much more in common with the Middle East